The cafeteria went dead silent except for the clatter of a dropped fork hitting linoleum. Jake Morrison lay on the floor, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in agony as he stared up at the petite brunette who had just destroyed his joint with a movement so fast that most people missed it entirely. "What the hell just happened?" someone whispered. The girl with the ponytail, the same ponytail Jake had yanked 30 seconds earlier, while making crude jokes to his buddies, stood calmly over him, not even breathing hard. "You dislocated my shoulder," Jake gasped, his voice cracking with pain and disbelief. She looked down at him with those same quiet green eyes that had been taking his harassment for weeks, and said simply, "Next time, keep your hands to yourself." An older maintenance worker who'd been mopping nearby dropped his mop and stared. "That was a perfect shoulder throw," he muttered to himself, loud enough for others to hear. "I haven't seen technique that clean since my Navy days." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Meet Riley Catherine Walsh. 22 years old, auburn hair usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, small frame that barely reached 5'4", emerald green eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing nothing. She had arrived at Riverside Technical College 3 months ago with one simple goal: to complete her automotive repair certification and disappear into a quiet life fixing engines. This place was a classic trade school, mostly young men from working-class families, plenty of them fresh out of high school and full of attitude. The automotive program was particularly male-dominated, with only 6 women among 42 students. Riley had chosen the back corner seat in every classroom, the last workstation in every garage bay, and the most isolated table in the cafeteria. She wanted to blend in, finish her coursework, and leave without making waves or drawing attention to herself. The plan had been working perfectly until Jake Morrison and his crew decided she was their new source of entertainment. Riverside Tech sat on the outskirts of Pine Valley, a blue-collar town where most families had worked in the local lumber mill or auto plants for generations. The college served as a pathway for kids who couldn't afford university but needed skills to make a decent living. The campus was practical rather than pretty. Concrete buildings, basic dormitories, and industrial training facilities that prepared students for real-world jobs in construction, automotive repair, welding, and electrical work. The student body reflected the town's demographics: hard-working kids from families who understood the value of honest labor, but also young men who'd grown up with certain assumptions about gender roles and who belonged where. Most of them weren't malicious, just products of their environment. But Jake Morrison was different. Jake was the kind of guy who saw quiet people as targets and women as objects to be conquered or dismissed. Riley had been dealing with Jake's escalating behavior for 3 weeks now. It started with comments about how she was too pretty to get her hands dirty, and evolved into increasingly aggressive attempts to get reactions from her. He'd block her path in hallways, make loud remarks about her appearance when she entered rooms, and generally treat her presence in the automotive program like a personal affront to his masculinity. Today had been the worst yet. During lunch in the crowded cafeteria, Riley was sitting alone with her tray of food and her textbook, trying to study engine specifications while eating. Jake approached with his usual entourage of followers, emboldened by their audience. "Hey there, Ponytail," he'd said, sliding uninvited into the seat across from her. "Still pretending you know what you're doing under a hood?" Riley had looked up briefly, made eye contact just long enough to acknowledge his presence, then returned to her textbook. This was her standard response: polite acknowledgement followed by quiet dismissal. It had worked with most of the other students who'd tested her boundaries, but it only seemed to fuel Jake's determination to get a bigger reaction. You know what your problem is? Jake had continued, his voice getting louder as other students started paying attention. You act like you're too good to talk to people, like you think you're smarter than everyone else here. His friends chuckled and encouraged him, enjoying the show. Maybe what you need is someone to teach you some manners. Riley had continued reading, her face calm and expressionless, but those who looked closely might have noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. The way her grip on the textbook had tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd dealt with guys like Jake before. In her experience, engaging only escalated things. Ignoring them usually worked, eventually. But Jake Morrison wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by women. Especially not by women who made him feel small and inadequate, just by existing in his space with more competence and focus than he could muster. So he'd made a decision that would change everything. Standing up from his chair, Jake had reached across the table and grabbed Riley's ponytail, yanking her head back hard enough to make her neck snap. When someone's talking to you, he'd said with a cruel grin, you look at them. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but it would be replayed in the minds of everyone present for years to come. Riley's reaction wasn't emotional or panicked. It was clinical, precise, and devastatingly effective. She'd moved like someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, someone for whom violence wasn't personal, but simply another tool to be applied when necessary. The maintenance worker was right about the technique being perfect. What he didn't know was why. The atmosphere at Riverside Technical College had been building toward this moment for weeks, though most people didn't realize it at the time. The automotive program existed in a bubble of old-school attitudes and unspoken hierarchies that had been passed down through generations of blue-collar workers. This wasn't just about learning to fix cars, it was about proving you belonged in a world where respect was earned through strength, volume, and the ability to take whatever was dished out. Jake Morrison had appointed himself the unofficial gatekeeper of this world. At 23, he was older than most of the other students, having spent 2 years working dead-end jobs after high school before deciding he needed actual skills. His extra experience, combined with his imposing 6'2" frame and natural charisma, had made him the de facto leader of the automotive program's social hierarchy. What Jake said mattered. Who Jake accepted or rejected set the tone for how everyone else treated newcomers. From day one, Jake had made it clear that Riley Walsh didn't belong. It wasn't just that she was a woman in a male-dominated field, though that was certainly part of it. There were 5 other women in the program, and Jake had found ways to coexist with them. Sarah Chen was loud and aggressive enough to earn grudging respect. Amanda Rodriguez came from a family of mechanics and could talk shop with the best of them. Lisa Thompson laughed at all the crude jokes and played along with the boys' club atmosphere. But Riley was different. Riley was quiet in a way that felt like judgment. She was competent in a way that made others feel inadequate. When she worked on engines, her movements were precise and confident, while other students, including Jake, often fumbled through procedures they were supposed to have mastered. When instructors asked questions, Riley knew the answers, but never volunteered them unless directly called upon. She made Jake feel like the amateur he secretly feared he was. The other students picked up on Jake's hostility and adjusted their behavior accordingly. In a social ecosystem where acceptance meant survival, most people chose sides based on power rather than principle. Riley's isolation wasn't accidental. It was engineered by a social structure that punished anyone who didn't fit the established mold. During group projects, Riley consistently ended up working alone or with whatever leftover partners remained after everyone else had chosen. In the garage bays, other students would subtly claim tools and equipment she needed, forcing her to wait or work around their schedules. In the cafeteria, conversations would quiet when she approached, not out of respect, but out of the kind of uncomfortable silence that made it clear she wasn't welcome. The instructors, all middle-aged men who'd grown up in similar environments, either didn't notice the dynamic or chose not to intervene. To them, this was just how things worked in the trades. If Riley couldn't handle some social pressure and establish her place in the pecking order, maybe she wasn't cut out for this line of work anyway. They'd seen plenty of students wash out over the years, and gender was often a factor, though they'd never admit it openly. Riley's response to all of this had been strategic silence. She'd learned long ago that reaction was often what bullies wanted most. Give them emotion, and they'd feed on it. Give them fear, and they'd escalate. Give them anger, and they'd use it to justify their behavior. But give them nothing, absolute calm, professional competence, and complete indifference to their social games. And eventually, most of them would move on to easier targets. This strategy had worked throughout high school, where she'd dealt with similar dynamics. It had worked during her brief stint in community college before transferring to Riverside Tech. It had even worked in her previous job at a local garage, where she'd been the only female mechanic among 8 men. Patience, professionalism, and superior skill had always been enough to outlast the worst of masculine insecurity. But Jake Morrison represented a different kind of problem. Where most bullies were opportunistic, striking when they sensed weakness or when the moment felt right, Jake was methodical. He'd made breaking Riley's composure into a personal project, and he approached it with the same determination he brought to rebuilding transmissions. His campaign had started subtly. Comments about how pretty girls didn't belong in auto shops. Observations about how she probably came from money and was just playing mechanic until she found a husband to support her. Jokes about how she'd probably cry the first time she broke a nail on an engine block. All delivered with a smile and presented as good-natured ribbing that she was too uptight to appreciate. When the subtle approach failed to get the reaction he wanted, Jake had escalated. He'd started positioning himself in her personal space during classroom discussions, standing close enough to make her uncomfortable but not close enough for instructors to notice. He'd begun timing his arrival at workstations to coincide with hers, creating situations where she'd have to ask him to move or work around him. He'd started speaking just loud enough for her to overhear when he made comments about her appearance or competence to his friends. The Ponytail incident hadn't been spontaneous. It had been the culmination of 3 weeks of calculated psychological pressure designed to provoke exactly the kind of emotional response that would justify whatever came next. In Jake's mind, he was conducting a scientific experiment to prove that Riley Walsh was just another uptight princess who would crumble under real pressure. What Jake hadn't considered was the possibility that Riley's silence wasn't weakness or fear. He'd mistaken strategic patience for helplessness, professional restraint for inability to defend herself. In his worldview, quiet people were victims waiting for someone strong enough to claim them. He'd built his entire identity around being that someone. The cafeteria had become Jake's favorite theater for these psychological games because it offered the largest audience and the most relaxed atmosphere. Away from the structured environment of classrooms and garage bays, social hierarchies could be displayed more openly. It was here that reputations were made and broken, where the unwritten rules of campus life were enforced through peer pressure and public humiliation. Riley had adapted by making herself as invisible as possible during mealtimes. She ate quickly, always carried a textbook to signal that she didn't want conversation, and chose seating that minimized her exposure to unwanted attention. But in an enclosed environment with limited seating options, complete avoidance was impossible. Jake had been watching her patterns, learning her routines, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. Today, with the cafeteria packed and his regular audience present, he'd decided it was time to escalate from psychological pressure to physical intimidation. What happened next would reveal that Riley Walsh had been hiding far more than just shyness behind her quiet demeanor. Riley's daily routine at Riverside Technical College was a masterclass in efficiency and strategic invisibility. Every morning, she arrived precisely 15 minutes before her first class, early enough to secure optimal seating, but not so early that she'd be alone with whoever else showed up first. She moved through the campus with purposeful direction, never wandering or lingering in common areas where casual conversations might develop into unwanted social obligations. In Professor Martinez's engine theory class, Riley consistently chose the seat 3 rows back, 2 seats in from the left wall. This position gave her clear sight lines to the instructor while placing her outside the natural gathering spots where the more social students clustered. She took notes by hand in neat, precise handwriting that covered every technical detail the professor mentioned. But she never asked questions during lectures, even when she clearly knew more about the subject than most of her classmates. Her mechanical aptitude had become impossible to hide, despite her best efforts to blend in. During practical exercises in the garage bays, Riley's movements around engines had a fluidity that spoke of deep familiarity with automotive systems. While other students fumbled with socket wrenches or struggled to identify basic components, Riley worked with the kind of muscle memory that suggested years of experience rather than months of training. Last Tuesday, during a transmission rebuild exercise, student Tommy Brennan had been struggling for 20 minutes to remove a stubborn torque converter. His frustration was mounting as he applied increasingly aggressive force with the wrong tools, coming dangerously close to damaging expensive equipment. Professor Harrison was occupied with another group across the garage, and Tommy's project partners were offering increasingly unhelpful suggestions. Riley had been working quietly at the adjacent bay, dismantling her own transmission with methodical precision. Without announcing her intentions or asking for permission, she'd simply walked over to Tommy's workstation, selected the proper tool from his disorganized collection, and demonstrated the exact technique needed to free the converter without damage. The entire interaction took less than 2 minutes and involved maybe 6 words of explanation. Tommy had stared at her in amazement. "How did you know to do that?" he'd asked. Riley had simply shrugged and returned to her own work, but the incident had been witnessed by half a dozen other students. Word spread quickly in the tight-knit program about the quiet girl who seemed to understand automotive systems at an almost intuitive level. Similar incidents had been accumulating over the weeks. Riley would quietly correct dangerous procedures before accidents occurred, suggest more efficient approaches to complex problems, and demonstrate techniques that impressed even the instructors. But she did all of this without fanfare or explanation, always returning immediately to her own work as if nothing significant had happened. Her tool organization was another source of silent commentary on everyone else's methods. While most students' toolboxes looked like tornado aftermath zones, Riley's equipment was arranged with military precision. Every wrench, socket, and measuring device had its designated place. Her tools were immaculately maintained, showing signs of heavy use but also careful preservation. She owned equipment that was clearly expensive and professional grade, far beyond what most students could afford or would think to purchase. Professor Harrison had begun watching Riley's work methods with increasing interest. During his 30 years of teaching automotive technology, he'd learned to recognize students who brought significant prior experience into the classroom. Riley demonstrated the kind of systematic approach and quality control that typically took years to develop. Her diagnostic thinking was particularly impressive. She could listen to an engine for 30 seconds and accurately identify problems that other students missed after hours of testing. Yet Riley never volunteered information about her background or experience. When directly asked about her automotive knowledge, she would give minimal responses that acknowledged the question without providing meaningful details. "I've done some work on cars," she might say, or "my family taught me some basics." These responses were technically truthful but deliberately uninformative. Her written assignments revealed similar contradictions. Riley's technical reports were flawless, demonstrating comprehensive understanding of complex automotive systems and regulations. Her prose was clear and professional, suggesting someone comfortable with formal communication. But her personal reflection essays, required assignments about career goals and learning experiences, were notably vague and generic, as if she were deliberately avoiding specific details about her past or plans. The mystery extended to her physical capabilities as well. Automotive work requires significant upper body strength and manual dexterity, especially when dealing with heavy components in awkward positions. Most female students in the program had needed time to build the muscle strength necessary for tasks like lifting cylinder heads or maneuvering transmissions. Riley had arrived already possessing the physical conditioning these jobs required. During a particularly challenging brake system overhaul, student Marcus Webb had been struggling to apply enough force to properly seat a stubborn brake caliper. Riley had been walking past with her own equipment when she noticed his difficulty. Without being asked, she'd taken the tool from his hands and completed the task with a smooth, powerful motion that demonstrated not just strength, but knowledge of exactly how much force to apply and at what angle. Marcus had commented later that Riley's grip strength felt like she'd been doing physical labor for years, not months. "Her hands are calloused in weird places," he'd told his friends, "like someone who's done a lot more than just schoolwork." These observations were creating an undercurrent of curiosity about Riley Walsh that made her increasingly difficult to ignore despite her efforts to remain invisible. Students were beginning to ask questions about her background, her training, and her long-term plans. The more mysterious she remained, the more interesting she became to people who might otherwise have overlooked her entirely. Her academic performance was equally mysterious. Riley consistently scored in the top 5% on technical examinations, often achieving perfect scores on complex diagnostic problems that challenged even the strongest students. Yet she never participated in study groups, never asked classmates for help, and never offered to tutor others despite clearly having knowledge that could benefit the entire class. The instructors had begun discussing Riley during their private faculty meetings. Professor Martinez mentioned her exceptional theoretical knowledge. Professor Harrison praised her practical skills and work quality. Professor Thompson noted her unusual maturity and professional demeanor, but none of them could explain where a 22-year-old woman had acquired such comprehensive automotive expertise, or why someone with her obvious abilities was enrolled in a basic certification program rather than pursuing advanced engineering studies. This combination of exceptional competence and deliberate mystery was creating exactly the kind of attention Riley had been trying to avoid, setting the stage for the confrontation that would soon reveal far more about her background than she had ever intended to share. The incident that first hinted at Riley's hidden capabilities happened on a gray Thursday afternoon during Advanced Diagnostics Lab. The automotive bay was filled with the usual sounds of students wrestling with complex electrical systems, muttering curses at uncooperative wiring harnesses, and calling out for help with multimeter readings. Riley was working alone at Bay 7, methodically tracing a mysterious power drain in a 2018 Ford Explorer that had been stumping students for 3 days. At Bay 4, a dangerous situation was developing that no one had noticed yet. Kevin Patel was attempting to disconnect a hybrid battery system without following proper safety protocols. The hybrid vehicle's high-voltage warning labels were clearly visible, but Kevin had grown frustrated with the tedious lockout procedures and decided to take shortcuts. He'd bypassed the safety interlocks and was reaching toward the orange high-voltage cables with standard tools, completely unaware that he was seconds away from potentially fatal electrocution. The hybrid system contained 400 volts of direct current, enough to kill instantly if contacted improperly. Kevin's rubber-soled shoes and dry conditions might have provided some protection, but his metallic tools and the dampness on his hands from handling coolant created a perfect conductive path. He was leaning into the engine bay, his torso positioned directly over the electrical connections, when his wrench slipped and began falling toward the exposed terminal. Riley's head snapped up from her own work with an alertness that seemed almost supernatural. Without hesitation or apparent thought, she dropped her diagnostic scanner and moved. Her response wasn't the jerky panic of someone reacting to unexpected danger. It was the fluid, purposeful motion of someone who had trained extensively for exactly this type of emergency. She crossed the 20 feet between workstations in 4 quick strides, her movement drawing startled glances from other students who couldn't understand why the quiet girl was suddenly running. As Kevin's wrench continued its trajectory toward the high-voltage terminal, Riley reached him and executed a precise shoulder check that knocked him sideways and away from the electrical hazard. The metallic tool clattered harmlessly against the vehicle's frame instead of making contact with the live electrical system. But Riley's intervention didn't stop there. In one continuous motion, she grabbed the emergency disconnect tool from Kevin's abandoned workstation and properly isolated the hybrid system's electrical supply. Her movements were economical and practiced, following safety protocols that most students had to reference from their textbooks. Completed the full lockout procedure in under 30 seconds, turning a potentially lethal situation into a routine maintenance operation. The entire sequence had unfolded so quickly that most students were still trying to process what they'd witnessed. Kevin stood against the far wall, breathing heavily and staring at the electrical connections he'd been about to contact. "What just happened?" he asked, his voice shaky with delayed realization of how close he'd come to serious injury. Riley was already walking back toward her own workstation, her expression calm and focused as if nothing unusual had occurred. "You were about to make contact with live voltage," she said matter-of-factly, not breaking stride. "The lockout procedures exist for a reason." Professor Harrison had been in his office reviewing inventory reports when he heard the commotion. He emerged to find students clustered around Bay 4, talking in excited whispers about what they'd just witnessed. When he learned what had transpired, his expression grew serious. Hybrid vehicle safety was one of his most emphasized topics, and Kevin's near mistake could have resulted in tragedy. "Miss Walsh," Professor Harrison called out, his voice carrying across the garage bay. "A word, please." Riley approached with the same measured pace she used for everything else, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that struck several observers as distinctly military. Professor Harrison studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Where did you learn hybrid safety protocols?" he asked directly. "Those lockout procedures you just performed aren't covered until next semester's advanced course." Riley met his gaze steadily. "I've had some previous exposure to electrical systems," she replied. "Basic safety principles are universal." Professor Harrison nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he found her explanation insufficient. Basic safety principles don't typically include emergency response procedures that advanced. Have you worked with hybrid vehicles before? "Some," Riley acknowledged, offering no additional details. The professor waited for elaboration that didn't come. Finally, he addressed the larger group. What Miss Walsh just demonstrated is exactly the kind of situational awareness and rapid response that prevents serious accidents in professional environments. I want everyone to review the hybrid safety protocols tonight, and we'll have a comprehensive safety drill tomorrow morning. As students dispersed back to their workstations, conversations buzzed with speculation about Riley's background. Her reaction time and technical knowledge had been impressive, but what struck many observers as most unusual was her emotional response, or rather her complete lack of one. She'd prevented a potentially fatal accident with the same calm efficiency she brought to routine maintenance tasks. Marcus Webb, who'd been working 2 bays over, approached Tommy Brennan with a puzzled expression. "Did you see how fast she moved?" he asked quietly. "That wasn't normal reflex time. That was like she was already expecting something to go wrong." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "And did you notice her stance when she was talking to Harrison? My brother's in the Marines, and he stands exactly like that when he's being questioned by superior officers." Similar conversations were taking place throughout the garage bay. Students who'd previously dismissed Riley as antisocial were now wondering what kind of training produced such rapid, competent responses to emergency situations. Her technical knowledge was impressive, but her crisis management skills suggested experience that went far beyond automotive education. Sarah Chen, one of the few other women in the program, had watched the entire incident from her position at Bay 2. She'd been trying to befriend Riley since the beginning of the semester with limited success. Now she approached Riley's workstation with renewed curiosity. "That was pretty amazing what you just did," Sarah said, leaning against Riley's workbench. "Kevin could have been seriously hurt." Riley glanced up from her diagnostic work, acknowledging the comment with a brief nod before returning her attention to the electrical schematic she was studying. Sarah persisted. "I mean, you reacted like you dealt with that kind of situation before. Have you worked as an emergency responder or something?" "No," Riley replied simply, continuing to trace electrical pathways with her multimeter probe. Sarah waited for additional explanation, but none came. Finally, she tried a different approach. "Well, where did you learn to move that fast? Do you do martial arts or sports or something?" This question caused Riley to pause momentarily in her work. She looked up at Sarah with an expression that might have been surprise, as if she hadn't considered that her physical capabilities were noteworthy. "I stay in shape," Riley said carefully. "Physical fitness is important in this kind of work." Sarah nodded, though she seemed unsatisfied with the response. "Right, but the way you moved, that looked like professional training, not just regular fitness." Riley's expression became more guarded. "I should get back to this diagnostic," she said, effectively ending the conversation. As Sarah walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just encountered someone with far more experience than a typical automotive student should possess. Riley's combination of technical expertise, physical capability, and emotional control suggested a background that extended well beyond anything she was willing to discuss. The incident had planted seeds of curiosity that would continue growing among students and faculty alike, setting the stage for increased scrutiny that would make Riley's preferred anonymity increasingly difficult to maintain. The aftermath of the hybrid battery incident marked a turning point in how Jake Morrison viewed Riley Walsh. What had started as casual harassment based on gender stereotypes evolved into something more personal and vindictive. Jake had witnessed Riley's expert crisis response, and rather than feeling grateful or impressed, he felt threatened and diminished. In his worldview, women weren't supposed to be more competent than men, especially not in areas he considered his domain. Jake's campaign against Riley intensified with calculated precision. He began arriving early to classes specifically to position himself where he could monitor her interactions with other students. When she demonstrated superior knowledge during practical exercises, he would make loud comments designed to undermine her credibility. "Must be nice to have Daddy's garage to practice in," he'd announce to anyone within earshot. "Some of us had to learn this stuff the hard way." The comments were carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt about Riley's legitimacy without making accusations that could be directly challenged. Jake understood that questioning her competence directly would make him look foolish, given her obvious skills. Instead, he attacked her character and motivation, suggesting that her abilities came from privilege rather than merit. His influence over the social dynamics of the automotive program was substantial. Jake had cultivated relationships with key students who served as informal leaders within different friend groups. When Jake expressed disapproval of someone, that sentiment rippled through the student body with surprising efficiency. Students who might have been curious about befriending Riley found themselves subtly discouraged from pursuing those connections. The isolation campaign became more sophisticated over time. Jake would time his approach to the tool checkout area to coincide with Riley's needs, creating delays that forced her to wait or work around his schedule. He'd position his project group near her workstation during collaborative exercises, filling the acoustic space with loud conversation that made concentration difficult. He'd ask instructors technical questions about topics Riley had already demonstrated mastery of, forcing her to either remain silent and appear disengaged or speak up and risk seeming arrogant. Professor Harrison began noticing the pattern during the third week of Jake's escalated behavior. Riley's participation in class discussions had decreased significantly, and she seemed increasingly isolated during group activities. When Harrison tried to include her more directly in demonstrations, Jake would invariably follow up with comments that reframed her contributions as showing off or attention-seeking behavior. "That's an interesting theory," Jake would say, after Riley provided a particularly insightful technical explanation. "Must be nice to memorize textbooks instead of learning through actual experience." The comment would be delivered with a smile and tone that made it difficult for instructors to address as inappropriate, but the implication was clear to everyone present. Jake's friends had initially been uncomfortable with the intensity of his focus on Riley. Tommy Brennan had even suggested that Jake was getting a little weird about the situation. But Jake's charisma and social position made direct confrontation difficult. Students who wanted to maintain their standing in the program's social hierarchy found it easier to go along with Jake's lead than risk becoming targets themselves. The psychological pressure campaign reached new levels during the fourth week when Jake began incorporating physical intimidation into his strategy. He would position himself in Riley's personal space during casual conversations, standing close enough to make her uncomfortable, but not close enough to be obviously inappropriate. He'd brush against her when passing in narrow spaces between workstations, creating contact that could be dismissed as accidental but felt deliberately invasive. Riley's response to this escalation remained consistent with her previous strategy. She maintained professional composure, avoided engagement when possible, and focused on her coursework with increased intensity. But observant students began noticing subtle changes in her behavior. She started carrying herself with heightened awareness, always positioning herself with clear sightlines to exits. Her responses to unexpected sounds or movements became more alert, suggesting someone accustomed to monitoring potential threats. The tension in the automotive program became palpable to anyone paying attention. Other students found themselves unconsciously choosing sides, even when they didn't fully understand what they were choosing between. The atmosphere during practical exercises grew strained as students navigated the social minefield that Jake had created around Riley's presence. Sarah Chen made several attempts to break through the isolation that was building around Riley. She'd invite her to join study groups, suggest partnering on projects, and try to initiate conversations about shared interests. But Jake's influence made these overtures socially risky for Sarah, and Riley's increasingly guarded responses suggested she recognized the awkward position Sarah was in. "I appreciate the offer," Riley would say when Sarah suggested collaboration, "but I work better independently." The responses were polite but clearly designed to protect Sarah from association with someone who had become a social liability. Professor Martinez observed the dynamics during his engine theory lectures with growing concern. Riley's test scores remained excellent, but her classroom participation had virtually disappeared. When he called on her directly, she provided correct but minimal answers, offering no additional insights or questions that might extend the discussion. The vibrant intellectual engagement he'd noticed in her early weeks had been systematically suppressed. The situation came to a head during a particularly tense practical exercise involving brake system diagnosis. Jake had positioned his team at the workstation directly adjacent to Riley's, creating opportunities for continuous commentary on her methods and conclusions. His running critique was delivered as educational discussion with his teammates, but the volume and timing made it clear that Riley was the intended audience. "See, the problem with people who learn from books instead of experience," Jake explained loudly while Riley worked on her brake diagnosis, "is they don't understand how systems actually fail in the real world. They memorize procedures but can't adapt when reality doesn't match the textbook." Riley's jaw tightened slightly, but she continued her methodical inspection of the brake components without acknowledging Jake's commentary. She'd identified the problem, a hairline crack in the master cylinder that was causing gradual fluid loss. But Jake's team was still struggling with basic diagnostic procedures. "Of course," Jake continued, his voice carrying across multiple workstations, "when you've got connections in the industry, you probably get to practice on problems that are already solved, not like the rest of us who have to figure things out from scratch." The accusation was more direct than Jake's usual approach, and several students looked up from their own work to see how Riley would respond. The implication that she was cheating or receiving unfair assistance was serious enough to demand some kind of reaction. Riley set down her diagnostic tools and turned to face Jake directly for the first time in weeks. The movement was controlled and deliberate, drawing attention from everyone in the immediate area. Her expression remained calm, but there was something in her posture that made several students unconsciously step back. "Is there something specific you'd like to discuss about brake system diagnosis?" Riley asked, her voice steady and professional. The question was phrased as an offer to help, but the tone carried an undertone that suggested Jake might want to reconsider his approach. Jake, emboldened by having finally provoked a direct response, smiled widely. "Just wondering if you'd like to share your secrets with those of us who didn't grow up in Daddy's garage." The comment drew nervous laughter from his teammates, but also created a moment of uncomfortable silence in the broader workspace. Professor Harrison appeared at that moment, having heard enough of the exchange to understand the tension. "Mr. Morrison, Miss Walsh, is there a technical question that needs addressing?" Jake's expression shifted instantly back to respectful student mode. "No, sir, just comparing diagnostic approaches with a classmate." The response was technically accurate but deliberately misleading about the nature of their interaction. Riley simply shook her head and returned to her work, leaving Professor Harrison to assess the situation based on incomplete information. The moment passed without resolution, but the dynamic it revealed would continue building pressure until something had to give. Have you ever been in a situation where someone's jealousy turned into systematic harassment, making you question whether staying quiet was strength or just enabling their behavior? Sometimes the hardest part isn't dealing with the bully, it's watching everyone else choose to look away rather than get involved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Riley's small apartment on Maple Street was a study in careful organization and deliberate minimalism. The furniture was functional rather than decorative. A single bed with military-tight corners, a small desk positioned near the window for optimal natural light, and a bookshelf lined with automotive manuals and technical journals. But hidden behind the mundane exterior of a student's living space were details that told a very different story about who Riley Walsh really was. On evenings when the weight of Jake's harassment felt particularly heavy, Riley would sit cross-legged on her bed, holding a worn photograph that she kept carefully preserved in a simple wooden frame. The image showed a woman in her early 40s wearing the crisp dress blues of a Marine Corps staff sergeant. The woman's bearing was unmistakably military, shoulders squared, chin raised, eyes focused with the kind of intensity that came from years of command responsibility. This was Staff Sergeant Diana Walsh, Riley's mother, photographed during her final promotion ceremony before retirement. Diana Walsh had been one of the Marine Corps' most respected hand-to-hand combat instructors, a specialist in close-quarters combat who had trained thousands of Marines in defensive tactics and personal protection. Her expertise wasn't theoretical. She'd served 3 combat deployments, earning commendations for valor under fire and developing innovative training protocols that were still used throughout the Corps. Marines who trained under Diana Walsh didn't just learn techniques. They learned to think like warriors, to assess threats instantly, and to respond with overwhelming precision when violence became unavoidable. Riley's childhood had been unlike anything her current classmates could imagine. While other kids were playing video games or attending soccer practice, Riley was learning to read body language for aggressive intent, understanding how leverage could overcome size disadvantages, and practicing defensive techniques until they became instinctive muscle memory. Diana had never intended to raise a fighter. Her goal was to raise a daughter who could protect herself in any situation life might present. Their training sessions began before dawn in the garage of their base housing, where Diana had converted half the space into a makeshift dojo. The concrete floor was covered with dense foam mats, and the walls were lined with training equipment that Diana had acquired over her military career. But these weren't casual self-defense lessons. They were comprehensive instruction in military-grade combat systems that most civilians would never encounter. "Violence is never the goal, Riley," Diana would say during their morning sessions, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the true cost of conflict. "But when someone forces violence upon you, your response must be immediate, decisive, and overwhelming. You end the threat completely, or you risk it escalating beyond your control." Diana taught her daughter techniques from multiple combat disciplines: Marine Corps martial arts program, Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and classical boxing. But more importantly, she taught her the mindset that made those techniques effective, how to recognize the pre-attack indicators that preceded violence, how to position herself advantageously in any physical space, how to transition from peaceful interaction to devastating response in the span of a heartbeat. The training wasn't just physical. Diana educated Riley about the psychology of aggressors, helping her understand that bullies typically escalated their behavior until they received the reaction they were seeking. "Most people who threaten violence are testing boundaries," Diana explained during one of their evening discussions. They want to know how far they can push before someone pushes back. The key is ensuring that when you do push back, the lesson is permanent. Riley's automotive expertise had also come from her mother, though through a different path. Diana's mechanical knowledge was born from military necessity, the ability to maintain and repair vehicles in hostile environments where professional mechanics weren't available. During her deployments, Diana had become known for keeping equipment operational under impossible conditions, jury-rigging solutions that kept convoys moving when standard procedures failed. When Diana retired from the Marines, she'd used her mechanical skills to open a small independent garage that specialized in military and emergency vehicle maintenance. Riley had spent her teenage years working alongside her mother, learning not just automotive repair, but the broader principles of problem-solving under pressure. Diana's approach to mechanics was the same as her approach to combat: methodical preparation, precise execution, and the ability to adapt when circumstances changed unexpectedly. The garage had been their sanctuary, a place where Riley could learn technical skills while absorbing the deeper lessons about competence, self-reliance, and quiet confidence that Diana embodied. They worked on everything from basic civilian vehicles to modified tactical trucks, with Diana providing running commentary about systems integration, failure analysis, and the importance of understanding how components work together, rather than just memorizing procedures. "Anyone can follow a repair manual," Diana would say, while guiding Riley through a complex transmission rebuild. But understanding why the manual says what it says, that's what separates a real mechanic from someone who just turns wrenches. When you understand the principles, you can solve problems that aren't in any book. Diana's influence extended beyond technical training into the realm of personal philosophy. She'd taught Riley that competence was its own form of power, but that power carried responsibility. "Never use your abilities to intimidate or harm unnecessarily," she would emphasize, "but never hesitate to use them when protection is required, either for yourself or for others who can't protect themselves." The photograph Riley held captured Diana during what would be their final months together. A drunk driver had ended Diana's life 18 months ago, leaving Riley with a legacy of skills, knowledge, and principles that she'd been carrying like a hidden burden ever since. The automotive program at Riverside Tech was supposed to be Riley's path toward rebuilding a life that made sense without her mother's guidance and protection. Diana had always emphasized that true strength was demonstrated through restraint rather than aggression. "Anyone can throw a punch," she'd said countless times, "but it takes real discipline to know when not to throw one. The goal is never to prove how tough you are, it's to ensure that you and the people you care about remain safe." This philosophy had guided Riley's response to Jake Morrison's escalating harassment. Every instinct Diana had trained into her was screaming that Jake represented a threat that needed to be addressed decisively. His behavior pattern was textbook predatory escalation, testing boundaries, increasing pressure, building toward some form of physical confrontation that he expected to win through intimidation and superior size. But Riley also understood that revealing her capabilities would fundamentally change her situation at Riverside Tech. Diana had taught her that once people knew you could handle violence, they either feared you or constantly tested you to see if the reputation was deserved. Either outcome would make the quiet, anonymous life Riley was trying to build impossible to maintain. Late at night, Riley would practice the forms her mother had taught her, moving through complex sequences of strikes, blocks, and grappling transitions with fluid precision. The movements were meditative, connecting her to memories of training sessions when Diana's presence had made everything feel manageable, but they also served as preparation, keeping her skills sharp for the confrontation she increasingly suspected was becoming inevitable. Riley understood something about Jake Morrison that her classmates didn't recognize. He wasn't going to stop escalating until he provoked the kind of response that would allow him to justify more serious retaliation. Men like Jake needed to believe they were victims in order to rationalize their aggressive behavior. They pushed boundaries specifically to create situations where their targets would be forced to react, providing the excuse they needed for escalation. Diana's voice echoed in Riley's memory during these moments of preparation. When someone forces you to choose between your safety and their comfort, choose your safety every single time. The world has enough victims. Don't volunteer to become one. The question that kept Riley awake at night wasn't whether she could handle Jake Morrison. Her mother's training had prepared her for threats far more serious than a campus bully. The question was whether she was prepared for the consequences of revealing who she really was beneath the carefully constructed facade of a quiet automotive student. As Riley held her mother's photograph and prepared for what felt like an inevitable confrontation, she knew that Diana would have understood the impossible position Jake's harassment had created. Sometimes, no matter how much you wanted to avoid conflict, other people's choices forced your hand. The skills were there when she needed them. The question was whether she was ready to use them. 10:31 a.m. The announcement came during Monday morning's General Assembly, delivered by Dean Patricia Cromwell with the kind of forced enthusiasm that administrative officials used when trying to make mandatory activities sound appealing. All students enrolled in hands-on technical programs would be required to participate in the annual skills showcase and safety demonstration scheduled for Friday afternoon. The event was designed to celebrate student achievements while reinforcing proper safety protocols across all disciplines. This year's showcase will feature practical demonstrations from each program, Dean Cromwell explained to the assembled student body. Automotive students will participate in a timed diagnostic challenge, followed by a physical fitness assessment designed to evaluate your readiness for the demanding physical aspects of professional automotive work. Riley felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach as the dean continued outlining the event's requirements. The physical fitness component would include obstacle courses, strength assessments, and coordination challenges, all conducted in front of students, faculty, and visiting industry professionals who had been invited to observe potential recruits. Jake Morrison's reaction to the announcement was immediate and obvious. He turned in his seat to look directly at Riley, his expression shifting to the predatory grin she'd learned to associate with his most malicious plans. This was exactly the kind of public forum he'd been waiting for, an official opportunity to challenge her capabilities in front of the largest possible audience. After the assembly, Jake wasted no time positioning himself near the automotive program's bulletin board where students were gathering to read the detailed requirements for their specific challenges. Riley attempted to review the posted information quickly and leave, but Jake's deliberate positioning made avoidance impossible. "Well, well," Jake announced loudly enough to draw attention from everyone in the immediate area. "Looks like we're all going to find out who really belongs in this program and who's just been pretending." His eyes locked onto Riley's face as he continued. "Should be interesting to see how some people handle real physical challenges instead of just book learning." The implications of his comment were clear to everyone present. Jake was publicly questioning Riley's physical capabilities while setting up Friday's event as a test of her legitimacy in the automotive program. Several students glanced between Jake and Riley, sensing the tension but uncertain how to respond to the obvious provocation. Riley's initial instinct was to employ her usual strategy of non-engagement. She started to turn away from the bulletin board without responding to Jake's commentary. But Jake had anticipated this reaction and positioned himself to block her exit route, forcing her to either push past him physically or acknowledge his presence. "Excuse me," Riley said quietly, her voice maintaining its characteristic calm despite the increasingly public nature of the confrontation. Jake smiled more widely, interpreting her polite request as evidence of weakness. "Sure thing, sweetheart, but you might want to start training now if you expect to keep up on Friday. Some of us have been doing real physical work our whole lives." The condescending endearment and obvious challenge created a moment of tense silence among the gathered students. Jake was crossing lines that had previously remained implicit, making his harassment more obvious and harder for others to ignore. Several students looked uncomfortable with the exchange, but none intervened. Tommy Brennan, who had been increasingly uneasy with Jake's behavior over the past weeks, finally spoke up. "Come on, man, let her get to class." The intervention was mild, but it represented the first time anyone had publicly questioned Jake's treatment of Riley. Jake's expression hardened slightly as he turned his attention to Tommy. "Just making conversation with a classmate," he said, his tone carrying a subtle warning. "Unless you think she needs someone to fight her battles for her." The comment was calculated to put Tommy in an impossible position: either retreat and leave Riley to handle Jake's harassment alone, or escalate the confrontation and risk becoming Jake's next target. It was a demonstration of Jake's skill at manipulating social dynamics to maintain his dominant position. Tommy hesitated, clearly torn between his discomfort with Jake's behavior and his reluctance to become involved in a conflict that could affect his own standing in the program. After a moment, he stepped back, his expression apologetic but his body language indicating withdrawal from the situation. Riley watched this exchange with the analytical detachment her mother had taught her, recognizing the social manipulation tactics Jake was employing. He was systematically isolating her by making intervention costly for potential allies, while escalating his own aggressive behavior to the point where some form of dramatic response became inevitable. "The physical challenges on Friday should be interesting," Jake continued, his attention returning to Riley. "I've heard the obstacle course is pretty demanding, lots of heavy lifting, climbing over barriers, that kind of thing. Probably not what someone's used to if they've spent most of their time with books instead of actual work." Riley met his gaze directly for the first time during the exchange. "I'll manage," she said simply, her voice carrying a confidence that seemed to surprise Jake slightly. "Will you?" Jake asked, leaning slightly closer and lowering his voice to a more intimate register that made the interaction feel even more threatening. "Because if you can't handle the physical requirements, maybe you should consider whether this is really the right program for you. Wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself in front of all those industry professionals." The suggestion that she should quit the program was Jake's most direct challenge yet, delivered in terms that made it clear he viewed Friday's event as an opportunity to publicly humiliate her and force her withdrawal from the automotive program entirely. His confidence in this strategy was evident in his body language and tone. Riley's response was measured and calm, but there was something in her posture that made several observing students take notice. "I appreciate your concern," she said, the formal politeness of her words contrasting with an undertone that suggested Jake might want to reconsider his assumptions about her capabilities. Jake either didn't recognize the warning in her tone or chose to ignore it. "Just trying to be helpful," he said with exaggerated innocence. "Some people aren't cut out for this kind of work, and it's better to find that out sooner rather than later." The gathering crowd of students was beginning to sense that something significant was building between Jake and Riley, though most couldn't articulate exactly what they were witnessing. The exchange had moved beyond typical classroom harassment into territory that felt more personal and potentially explosive. Professor Harrison emerged from his office at that moment, drawn by the unusual concentration of students around the bulletin board. His presence immediately changed the dynamic, causing Jake to step back and assume a more neutral posture, while Riley used the distraction to finally extract herself from the confrontation. "Lots of interest in Friday's challenges, I see," Professor Harrison observed, his experienced eye taking in the tension that was still evident, despite the students' attempts to appear casual. "I hope everyone's planning to take the safety requirements seriously. These demonstrations are meant to showcase your skills, not create opportunities for accidents." His emphasis on safety and his direct look at Jake suggested that Professor Harrison was more aware of the underlying tensions than he'd previously indicated. The warning was subtle but clear. Friday's event would be closely supervised, and any behavior that endangered student safety would be addressed immediately. As students began dispersing to their next classes, Riley found herself walking alongside Sarah Chen, who had witnessed the entire exchange from her position near the bulletin board. "That was pretty intense," Sarah said quietly, matching Riley's pace as they headed toward the garage complex. "Jake's really got it out for you, doesn't he?" Riley nodded acknowledgement without elaborating on the situation. She was processing the implications of Jake's public challenge while calculating the risks and benefits of various response strategies. Friday's event would force a confrontation she'd been trying to avoid, but it would also provide an opportunity to address Jake's behavior definitively. "You know," Sarah continued, "for what it's worth, I think Jake's worried about something. Guys like him don't usually go after someone unless they feel threatened somehow." The observation was perceptive, and Riley glanced at Sarah with increased interest. "What do you mean?" Sarah shrugged. "You're obviously good at this stuff. Really good, and you don't seem impressed by his whole alpha male routine. Some guys can't handle that combination." As they entered the garage bay for their next practical session, Riley considered Sarah's analysis. Jake's behavior did suggest someone who felt his position threatened rather than someone merely exercising casual dominance. The realization didn't change her situation, but it helped explain the escalating intensity of his harassment. Friday was 3 days away, 3 days to prepare for a confrontation that would determine whether she could continue pursuing the quiet life she'd tried to build, or whether Jake Morrison's aggressive insecurity would force her to reveal capabilities that would change everything about her time at Riverside Tech. The skills her mother had trained into her were ready. The question was whether Riley was prepared to use them in front of an audience that would never see her the same way again. Friday afternoon arrived with unseasonably warm weather and an atmosphere of nervous energy that permeated the entire Riverside Tech campus. The skills showcase had drawn an impressive crowd of industry professionals, family members, and students from other programs who had come to observe the automotive department's demonstrations. Temporary bleachers had been erected around the main garage complex, and the obstacle course had been set up in the adjacent parking lot where spectators could easily view the physical challenges. Riley arrived at the designated staging area 30 minutes before her scheduled time, wearing the required uniform of dark blue coveralls and steel-toed boots. Her auburn hair was pulled back in its characteristic ponytail, and her expression carried the same calm focus she brought to routine coursework. But beneath the surface composure, she was conducting the kind of tactical assessment her mother had taught her to perform before any potentially volatile situation. The physical challenge course consisted of 6 stations designed to simulate real-world automotive work demands. Students would rotate through exercises that included lifting and maneuvering a 150-pound transmission, climbing over simulated vehicle chassis to access overhead components, crawling under mock car frames to demonstrate undercarriage work capabilities, carrying heavy tool cases across uneven terrain. and completing precise manual dexterity tasks while wearing protective gear that limited visibility and mobility. Jake Morrison had positioned himself strategically among the early participants, completing his run with theatrical displays of strength and competence clearly designed to establish a performance standard that he believed Riley couldn't match. His time through the course was respectable but not exceptional, though his commentary to fellow students suggested he viewed it as a benchmark that would expose less qualified participants. "Not too bad for someone who actually works on cars for a living," Jake announced loudly enough for Riley to overhear as she watched other students navigate the obstacles. "Should be interesting to see how people who learned everything from textbooks handle real physical challenges." The comment drew nervous laughter from some students, but also created an obvious expectation that Riley's performance would be substandard. Several industry observers had also noticed Jake's commentary and were paying attention to see whether his predictions would prove accurate. Professor Harrison approached Riley as she completed her equipment check before entering the course. "Miss Walsh," he said quietly, "I want you to know that this assessment is about safety and competence, not competition. Take your time, focus on proper technique, and don't let anyone pressure you into taking unnecessary risks." His words were professionally appropriate, but Riley detected an undertone of concern that suggested Professor Harrison was aware of the social dynamics surrounding her participation. The warning about unnecessary risks seemed particularly pointed, given Jake's obvious attempts to frame the event as a direct challenge to her legitimacy. Riley nodded acknowledgement and stepped up to the starting line, where a small crowd had gathered to observe her run through the course. The attention was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid throughout her time at Riverside Tech, but Jake's systematic harassment had made this moment inevitable. The first station required lifting the transmission assembly from ground level to a work surface approximately waist-high. Most students approached this task with visible effort, using careful technique to manage the unwieldy weight without injury. Riley assessed the component briefly, positioned herself with textbook-perfect lifting posture, and hoisted the transmission with smooth efficiency that made the 150-pound weight appear significantly lighter than it actually was. The ease of her movement drew surprised murmurs from observers who had expected to see her struggle with the heaviest component in the course. Jake's expression shifted from confident anticipation to something that looked more like concern as he watched Riley transition smoothly to the second station. The climbing obstacle simulated working over engine compartments and required participants to maneuver their bodies into awkward positions while maintaining balance and control. Riley approached the challenge with fluid movements that demonstrated exceptional upper body strength and spatial awareness. Where other students had needed multiple attempts to navigate the overhead components safely, Riley completed the sequence in a single smooth motion that showcased both physical capability and technical understanding of the simulated work environment. By the third station, crawling under the mock chassis to simulate undercarriage work, spectators were beginning to realize they were watching something unusual. Riley's movements under the vehicle were efficient and confident, showing none of the claustrophobia or spatial disorientation that had affected several previous participants. Her technique was so polished that industry professionals in the audience began commenting to each other about her obvious experience with this type of work. The fourth station involved carrying heavy tool cases across terrain designed to simulate uneven garage floors and outdoor work sites. This challenge had been particularly difficult for smaller students, requiring them to make multiple trips or struggle visibly with loads that tested their physical limits. Riley assessed the available equipment, selected an efficient carrying configuration, and traversed the course with steady, purposeful strides that made the task appear routine rather than challenging. Jake's confidence was clearly shaken by this point. What he had expected to be Riley's public humiliation was instead becoming a demonstration of capabilities that exceeded his own performance. His attempts at dismissive commentary had stopped as other students began openly expressing amazement at Riley's competence. The fifth station required precise manual dexterity while wearing thick protective gloves and safety equipment that significantly limited visibility and tactile feedback. This challenge was designed to simulate detailed work in confined spaces where normal dexterity was compromised by safety requirements. Riley completed the intricate assembly task with methodical precision that suggested extensive experience working under exactly these conditions. Sarah Chen, who had been watching from the student section, turned to Tommy Brennan with an expression of amazement. "Where the hell did she learn to do all this?" she whispered. "That's not normal student skill level." Tommy nodded agreement, his own assumptions about Riley's background clearly being revised as he watched her performance. "My uncle owns a garage," he replied quietly. "He's been doing this work for 20 years, and he doesn't move that efficiently through those obstacles." The final station involved completing a complex diagnostic task while managing the physical demands of accessing components in awkward positions. This challenge combined the technical knowledge assessments with the physical capability requirements, creating a comprehensive test of real-world automotive competence. Riley approached the station with the same calm focus she'd demonstrated throughout the course, efficiently identifying and addressing the simulated mechanical problems while maintaining perfect safety protocols. When Riley completed the final station and her time was announced, a moment of stunned silence fell over the assembled crowd. She hadn't just completed the course competently, she had posted the fastest time of the day while demonstrating technique quality that surpassed most of her classmates by significant margins. Professor Harrison approached her with an expression that mixed professional pride with obvious curiosity. "Outstanding performance, Miss Walsh," he said formally. "Your technique and efficiency were exceptional. But the professional congratulations were overshadowed by the social implications of what had just occurred." Riley had not only met Jake's challenge, she had exceeded it so dramatically that his previous harassment now appeared foolish, rather than threatening. The revelation of her physical capabilities had fundamentally changed how everyone present viewed her, but it had also raised new questions about her background that would be impossible to ignore. Jake Morrison stood among the spectators with an expression of shocked disbelief that was rapidly transforming into something that looked more dangerous than his previous dismissive arrogance. The public nature of his misjudgment had humiliated him in front of the same audience he'd intended to use for Riley's embarrassment. For someone whose identity was built around physical dominance and competence, the reversal was devastating. As Riley walked back toward the staging area, she could feel the weight of dozens of stares and whispered conversations that were already beginning to reshape her reputation at Riverside Tech. The quiet anonymity she'd worked so carefully to maintain was gone, replaced by a notoriety that would bring its own set of challenges and complications. But the most immediate concern was Jake Morrison's reaction to having his assumptions so publicly and thoroughly disproven. Men like Jake didn't typically respond well to this kind of humiliation, and Riley's training had taught her to recognize the signs of someone whose wounded pride was shifting toward more dangerous forms of retaliation. The demonstration was over, but the real confrontation was just beginning. The cafeteria at Riverside Tech had never felt smaller or more oppressive than it did the following Monday lunchtime. Word of Riley's exceptional performance during Friday's skills showcase had spread throughout the campus over the weekend, creating an atmosphere of curiosity and speculation that made her usual strategy of invisible routine impossible to maintain. Students who had previously ignored her completely now watched her movements with obvious interest, trying to reconcile the quiet girl they thought they knew with the demonstration of capability they'd witnessed. Riley had chosen her usual corner table, positioning herself with clear sight lines to multiple exits, while attempting to focus on her automotive systems textbook. But the normal rhythms of cafeteria conversation had been replaced by something more charged and unpredictable. She could feel Jake Morrison's presence before she saw him, her mother's training having made her acutely sensitive to the psychological pressure that preceded confrontation. Jake approached her table with deliberate slowness, accompanied by his core group of followers, but moving with the kind of focused intent that suggested this interaction would be different from his previous harassment campaigns. His weekend had clearly been spent processing the humiliation of Friday's events, and his expression carried the dangerous combination of wounded pride and escalating aggression that Riley recognized as a precursor to violence. The cafeteria's normal noise level dropped noticeably as other students became aware of the unfolding confrontation. Conversations continued, but with the artificial quality of people pretending not to pay attention while actually monitoring every detail of what was about to occur. Even students who had no direct involvement in the automotive program had heard about Friday's demonstration and understood that something significant was building between Jake and Riley. Well, Jake said as he stopped directly in front of Riley's table, his voice carrying the kind of forced casualness that made everyone within earshot pay attention. Look who thinks she's hot stuff now. His positioning was deliberately intimidating, close enough to invade her personal space, but not quite close enough to be obviously threatening to casual observers. Riley looked up from her textbook with the same measured calm she'd maintained throughout weeks of escalating harassment. "Is there something you needed, Jake?" she asked, her voice carrying no emotion beyond polite professional inquiry. The response was calculated to de-escalate while establishing clear boundaries about their interaction. Jake's smile was sharp and predatory. "Just wondering if you're planning to keep pretending you're something special, or if you're ready to admit what everyone's starting to figure out." He paused for dramatic effect, ensuring maximum audience attention before continuing. "That little show on Friday was cute, but some of us know the difference between a one-time performance and actually being tough." The accusation was vague enough to avoid direct confrontation, while clearly implying that Riley's demonstrated competence was somehow fraudulent or unsustainable. Jake was testing the waters, probing for a reaction that would give him justification for escalation, while maintaining plausible deniability about his aggressive intent. Riley's response was to close her textbook carefully and meet Jake's gaze directly. "I'm not sure what you're trying to prove," she said quietly, "but I'd prefer to eat my lunch in peace." The words were polite, but her posture had shifted subtly into something more alert and ready, a change that was invisible to most observers but immediately apparent to anyone with combat training. Jake interpreted her measured response as weakness rather than restraint. "The thing is," he continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive, "some of us have been doing this work our whole lives. We don't need to show off for teachers or put on little demonstrations to prove we belong here." His implication that Riley's performance had been artificial was delivered with enough volume to ensure most of the cafeteria could hear his challenge. Several students had stopped pretending to ignore the confrontation and were now openly watching the exchange. Sarah Chen had moved closer to Riley's table, her expression showing concern but also uncertainty about whether intervention would help or make things worse. Tommy Brennan was watching from across the room, clearly torn between his growing discomfort with Jake's behavior and his reluctance to become directly involved. Riley stood up slowly, her movement controlled and deliberate. The action brought her to full height, which, while not impressive compared to Jake's size, somehow made her seem more rather than less formidable. "I think this conversation is over," she said, beginning to gather her belongings with calm efficiency. But Jake had committed too much to the confrontation to allow her to simply walk away. His weekend of brooding over Friday's humiliation had built pressure that demanded release, and Riley's continued composure was only fueling his anger. "You know what I think?" he said, stepping closer and raising his voice further. "I think you're just another princess who learned a few tricks and thinks that makes her tough. But when it really matters, when someone actually challenges you, you'll fold just like every other fake." The insult was delivered with enough force and volume to ensure that everyone in the immediate area heard it clearly. Jake had crossed the line from harassment into open hostility, creating a moment that demanded some kind of response. The cafeteria had gone almost completely quiet, with dozens of students now openly staring at the confrontation. Riley set down her backpack and turned to face Jake completely, her movement creating a subtle shift in her stance that anyone with military training would have recognized as a combat-ready position. "I don't want any trouble," she said clearly, her voice carrying throughout the quiet cafeteria. "Please let me pass." The request was formal and reasonable, but it was also loud enough for everyone present to hear, establishing for any potential witnesses that she had attempted to de-escalate the situation peacefully. Jake, however, was beyond the point where reasonable responses would satisfy his need for confrontation. "Or what?" Jake demanded, his voice now openly aggressive and threatening. "What are you going to do if I don't?" He stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate rather than communicate. "Maybe it's time someone taught you what happens to people who think they're better than everyone else." The threat was explicit enough that several students began reaching for their phones, sensing that something serious was about to occur. Professor Harrison was in his office reviewing lesson plans, unaware of the situation developing in the cafeteria. The campus security officer was conducting rounds in the dormitory complex, too far away to intervene quickly if the situation escalated to violence. Riley's training kicked in with crystalline clarity. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. When someone escalates to direct threats, they've already decided to use violence. Your choice isn't whether to fight, it's whether to fight on your terms or theirs. Jake's body language, positioning, and vocal aggression indicated someone who had moved beyond harassment into active preparation for physical confrontation. "Jake," Riley said, her voice remaining calm but carrying a new undertone of authority, "you need to step back and walk away right now." The warning was clear and direct, delivered loudly enough for witnesses, while giving Jake one final opportunity to de-escalate before she was forced to respond to his threat. Jake's response was to laugh mockingly and take another step closer, bringing him well within striking distance while positioning himself to use his size advantage. "Make me," he said with cruel satisfaction, confident that he had finally pushed Riley into a corner where her only options were submission or a physical confrontation. He was certain he would win. What Jake didn't understand was that Riley had been mentally preparing for this exact scenario since their first hostile interaction. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this, had tried every de-escalation strategy her mother had taught her, but Jake's escalating aggression had made physical confrontation inevitable. The question wasn't whether she could handle him. Her training made that outcome certain. The question was whether she was prepared for the consequences of revealing her true capabilities in front of dozens of witnesses who would never see her the same way again. Riley's response was measured and final. "Last chance, Jake. Walk away." Jake's answer was to reach toward her ponytail with the same aggressive motion he'd used to humiliate other students in the past. But this time his target was someone whose mother had spent years preparing her for exactly this moment. The confrontation that had been building for weeks was about to explode into violence that would change everything for everyone involved. Jake's hand had barely made contact with Riley's ponytail when the world shifted into the kind of violent clarity that separated trained fighters from everyone else. His fingers closed around her hair with the confident grip of someone who had used physical intimidation successfully throughout his life, yanking her head back with enough force to cause pain and establish dominance. But the reaction he expected, fear, submission, or helpless anger, never came. Instead, Riley moved with the fluid precision of someone who had drilled these exact scenarios thousands of times under her mother's demanding instruction. Her response wasn't emotional or desperate. It was clinical, systematic, and devastatingly effective. As Jake's grip tightened on her hair, Riley's left hand shot up to control his wrist, trapping his arm in position while her right elbow drove backward into his solar plexus with surgical accuracy. The strike landed with enough force to double Jake over, his diaphragm spasming as his breath exploded out in a shocked gasp. But Riley wasn't finished. In one continuous motion, she pivoted on her left foot, while maintaining control of his trapped arm, using his forward momentum and compromised position to execute a perfect shoulder throw that sent all 6 feet and 200 pounds of Jake Morrison flying through the air before crashing into the cafeteria floor with bone-jarring impact. The entire sequence, from initial contact to Jake hitting the ground, lasted less than 3 seconds. Most observers didn't have time to process what they were seeing before it was over. Jake lay on the linoleum floor, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in agony and disbelief as he stared up at the petite brunette who had just dismantled him with techniques he'd never seen outside of professional fighting competitions. "What the hell just happened?" someone whispered from the crowd of stunned students who had witnessed the confrontation. The question echoed what everyone was thinking as they tried to reconcile the quiet girl they thought they knew with the demonstration of combat expertise they'd just witnessed. Riley stood calmly over Jake's prone form, not even breathing hard from the brief physical confrontation. Her expression remained composed, but there was something in her posture, a readiness and alertness, that made it clear the encounter could escalate further if Jake chose to continue the aggression. "You dislocated my shoulder," Jake gasped, his voice cracking with pain and humiliation. "Next time, keep your hands to yourself," Riley replied simply, her voice carrying the same calm authority she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. The response was delivered loudly enough for the gathered crowd to hear clearly, establishing for any potential investigators that Jake had initiated physical contact and she had responded defensively. The cafeteria erupted in shocked conversation as students processed what they'd witnessed. Cell phones appeared throughout the crowd as people began recording the aftermath, though the actual confrontation had happened too quickly for most to capture. Jake's friends rushed to his aid, helping him into a sitting position, while he continued clutching his shoulder and staring at Riley with a mixture of pain and disbelief. From the maintenance area near the kitchen, an older man in custodial uniform had witnessed the entire exchange. Frank Kowalski was a Vietnam veteran who had spent 2 tours in Marine reconnaissance before transitioning to civilian work. He recognized immediately what he had just seen. Not a lucky amateur defending herself, but a trained fighter executing techniques with professional-level precision. "That was a perfect shoulder throw," Frank muttered to himself, his voice carrying enough for nearby students to hear. "Haven't seen technique that clean since my corps days." His commentary added another layer of credibility to what observers were struggling to understand about Riley's background and training. Professor Harrison arrived at the cafeteria within minutes, drawn by reports from students who had run to find him after witnessing the confrontation. He found Jake still on the floor receiving first aid from his friends, while Riley sat calmly at her original table, apparently reading her textbook as if nothing unusual had occurred. The contrast between Jake's obvious distress and Riley's complete composure told its own story about who had controlled the encounter. "What happened here?" Professor Harrison demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing volatile situations involving young adults with more testosterone than judgment. The question was directed at the room generally, but his experience suggested he would get the most accurate account from witnesses rather than participants. Multiple students began speaking simultaneously, their accounts overlapping and excited, but consistent in the basic facts. Jake had approached Riley's table, escalated the verbal confrontation, made physical contact against her will, and been subdued with techniques that appeared far beyond normal self-defense training. The unanimity of the witness accounts made it clear that Riley had acted defensively rather than aggressively. Sarah Chen provided the most coherent narrative. Jake was harassing her, getting louder and more threatening. Riley asked him multiple times to leave her alone. When he grabbed her hair, she defended herself. Sarah's account was factual and clear, establishing the sequence of escalation that had led to physical confrontation. Professor Harrison turned his attention to Riley, who looked up from her textbook with the same calm expression she brought to routine academic discussions. "Miss Walsh, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" His concern was professionally appropriate, but his tone suggested he was more worried about Jake's condition than hers. "I'm fine, Professor," Riley replied simply. "Jake initiated physical contact and I responded appropriately." Her statement was concise and accurate, offering no unnecessary details while clearly establishing the defensive nature of her actions. The paramedics arrived shortly afterward, called by someone who had recognized that Jake's shoulder injury was serious enough to require professional medical evaluation. As they assessed his condition and prepared him for transport to the campus health center, Jake continued staring at Riley with an expression that mixed pain, humiliation, and something that looked like fear. "Who are you?" Jake asked quietly, his question carrying none of his previous arrogance or aggression. The confrontation had fundamentally changed his understanding of who he'd been harassing for weeks, and the reality of Riley's capabilities had shattered his assumptions about their relative positions in any social hierarchy. Riley met his gaze directly. "Someone who asked you to leave her alone," she said simply, her response offering no additional information about her background or training, while reinforcing the fundamental issue that had led to their confrontation. As Jake was helped to his feet and escorted toward the exit by paramedics, the crowd of students began dispersing, but their conversations buzzed with speculation about what they'd witnessed. Riley's demonstration of combat skills had answered some questions about her competence and confidence, but it had raised many more about her background, training, and the experiences that had prepared her for exactly this type of confrontation. Professor Harrison remained at Riley's table after the other students had left, his expression thoughtful as he processed the implications of what had occurred. "Miss Walsh," he said carefully, "that was an impressive display of self-defense technique. Where did you learn to handle yourself like that?" Riley's response was consistent with her pattern of revealing minimal information about her past. "I've had some training," she acknowledged, without elaboration. Professor Harrison nodded slowly, recognizing that he wouldn't get additional details through direct questioning, but the level of skill Riley had demonstrated suggested a background that extended far beyond casual self-defense classes. and his experience with students from military families made him suspect there were significant elements of her story that she preferred to keep private. The confrontation was over, but its implications would reshape Riley's experience at Riverside Tech in ways that neither she nor anyone else could fully predict. The quiet anonymity she had worked so carefully to maintain was gone, replaced by a reputation that would bring its own unique challenges and opportunities. Word of the cafeteria incident would spread throughout the campus within hours, creating a legend that would follow Riley for the remainder of her time at Riverside Tech and beyond. The transformation in how people treated Riley Walsh was immediate and comprehensive. Within 24 hours of the cafeteria incident, every student at Riverside Tech had heard some version of the story about the quiet girl who had put Jake Morrison on the ground with techniques that left witnesses comparing her to professional fighters. The details varied depending on who was telling the tale, but the core facts remained consistent. Jake had escalated from weeks of harassment to physical aggression, and Riley had ended the confrontation with devastating efficiency. Jake Morrison's absence from campus, he was receiving treatment for his dislocated shoulder and undergoing disciplinary review, created a power vacuum in the automotive program's social hierarchy that nobody quite knew how to fill. Students who had previously aligned themselves with Jake's aggressive dominance were suddenly uncertain about their positions, while those who had been intimidated by his behavior found themselves breathing easier for the first time in months. The most significant change was in how other students approached Riley herself. The wariness and dismissive attitudes that had characterized her social isolation were replaced by something more complex, a mixture of respect, curiosity, and cautious deference that suggested people were reassessing everything they thought they knew about her. Students who had never spoken to her before began finding reasons to initiate conversations, though their approach was notably more respectful than the casual familiarity most classmates shared. Tommy Brennan was among the first to acknowledge the change directly. He approached Riley during Wednesday's practical session with an expression that mixed embarrassment about his previous inaction with genuine admiration for her handling of Jake's harassment. "I wanted to apologize," he said quietly, positioning himself near her workstation while she performed routine maintenance on a cylinder head assembly. Riley looked up from her work with the same measured attention she gave to technical discussions. "For what?" she asked, though her tone suggested she understood exactly what Tommy was referencing. "For not saying something sooner about Jake's behavior," Tommy replied, his discomfort evident but his sincerity clear. "I knew what he was doing wasn't right, but I didn't want to get involved. That was cowardly, and I'm sorry you had to deal with that alone." The apology was more than Riley had expected, and certainly more than she'd received from most people who had witnessed Jake's systematic harassment without intervening. "I appreciate that," she said simply, returning her attention to her work, while leaving the conversation open for Tommy to continue if he chose. "The thing is," Tommy continued, encouraged by her receptive response, "a lot of us are curious about your background, not trying to pry or anything, but what you did to Jake. That wasn't normal self-defense. That was professional-level training." He paused, clearly uncertain about how directly to ask the questions that were circulating among students. Riley's response was consistent with her long-established pattern of minimal disclosure about her personal history. "I've had some instruction in personal protection," she acknowledged without elaboration, her focus remaining on the precise adjustment of valve clearances she was performing. Tommy nodded, recognizing that he wouldn't get more detailed information through direct questioning, but her willingness to acknowledge having instruction rather than dismissing the topic entirely was more than she'd shared with most people about her capabilities. Sarah Chen joined the conversation, having observed the exchange while working at the adjacent station. "What I want to know she said with characteristic directness, is whether you're planning to stay in the program now that everyone knows you could probably teach half these classes yourself. The observation was more perceptive than Riley had anticipated. Sarah was right that her demonstrated competence, both in Friday's skills showcase and in handling Jake's aggression, had raised questions about why someone with her obvious abilities was enrolled in a basic automotive certification program. The curiosity was understandable, but it was also exactly the kind of attention Riley had been trying to avoid. "I'm here to learn," Riley replied, her answer technically accurate while avoiding the deeper questions about her motivations and long-term plans. The program offers good training opportunities. Professor Harrison had been monitoring these interactions with growing interest. Riley's performance in his classes had already marked her as exceptional, but recent events had revealed capabilities that suggested a background far more complex than her student records indicated. During Thursday's lecture on advanced diagnostic systems, he made a decision that would publicly acknowledge what many students were already recognizing privately. "Before we begin today's lesson," Professor Harrison announced to the assembled class, "I want to address the recent incidents involving student conduct and safety." His tone was formal and serious, drawing immediate attention from everyone present. Miss Walsh's response to harassment and physical aggression demonstrated exactly the kind of situational awareness and defensive capability that we hope all our students will develop. The public recognition was both validation and spotlight, acknowledging Riley's handling of Jake's behavior, while also calling attention to her skills in a way that would make future anonymity impossible. Students who had missed the cafeteria confrontation now understood that something significant had occurred, while those who had witnessed it heard their observations confirmed by faculty authority. Professor Harrison continued, "Moving forward, I'm implementing a peer mentorship program where experienced students will work with those who might benefit from additional guidance." His eyes met Riley's as he spoke. "Miss Walsh, I'd like you to consider serving as a mentor for students who are struggling with the physical demands or safety protocols of automotive work." The invitation was both honor and responsibility, recognizing Riley's exceptional competence while creating a formal role that would utilize her skills constructively. It was also an implicit acknowledgement that her abilities exceeded those of typical students and should be channeled toward helping others rather than remaining hidden. Riley's acceptance was measured but clear. "I'd be happy to help other students with their coursework," she said, her response professional and appropriate while avoiding any suggestion of superiority over her classmates. The mentorship role transformed Riley's social position at Riverside Tech completely. Students who had previously avoided her now actively sought her guidance on technical problems, safety procedures, and physical challenges. Her natural teaching ability, inherited from her mother's instructional background, made these interactions productive and educational, rather than intimidating. Within 2 weeks, Riley found herself at the center of an informal support network that included students from multiple technical programs who had heard about her expertise and sought her assistance. The role was entirely different from the anonymous isolation she had originally planned, but it felt more natural and sustainable than her previous strategy of hiding her capabilities. The most unexpected development was a conversation with Dean Cromwell, who requested a private meeting 3 weeks after the cafeteria incident. "Miss Walsh," the dean said during their discussion in her office, "your academic performance and practical skills are exceptional. Have you considered advanced certifications or specialized training programs that might better match your existing expertise?" The suggestion opened possibilities Riley hadn't seriously considered, pathways that would acknowledge her advanced knowledge while providing genuine learning opportunities rather than requiring her to pretend ignorance of subjects she had already mastered. As Riley walked across campus that afternoon, she reflected on how completely her situation had changed from the quiet anonymity she had sought when arriving at Riverside Tech. The confrontation with Jake Morrison had forced her to reveal capabilities she had wanted to keep hidden, but the consequences had been more positive than she had anticipated. Students now approached her with respect rather than dismissal. Faculty recognized her competence and created opportunities to use it constructively. The harassment and social isolation that had characterized her early weeks at Riverside Tech had been replaced by a position of informal leadership that felt both challenging and fulfilling. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Sometimes the greatest service we can provide is teaching others to be capable of protecting themselves. Diana Walsh had raised her daughter to be self-reliant and formidable, but also to understand that strength carried responsibility to help those who were still developing their own capabilities. Riley had learned that hiding exceptional abilities might provide temporary peace, but using them to lift others up created something more valuable, a community where competence was recognized and harassment was no longer tolerated. Sometimes the most powerful response to a bully isn't just defending yourself. It's creating an environment where bullying becomes impossible to sustain. The quiet girl who had wanted only to blend in had become something more important, a leader who proved that real strength doesn't need to announce itself, but when it acts, it changes everything for everyone around it. Have you ever discovered that the very thing you were trying to hide about yourself was exactly what others needed to see? Sometimes our greatest gifts are the ones we're most afraid to share, but when we finally do, they don't just change our own lives. They transform the lives of everyone around us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.